All right, I mean, you guys have known me a long time. You know that I forget things quite a bit. Like, you tell me, hey, Aaron, can you announce this today? I'll be like, sure. And then I'll get up here and like 10 minutes later, you're like, Aaron, you forgot to announce. Yeah, I know. Go stand up, announce it. Just, my memory's not all that great. And there are times when that does not come in handy, believe it or not. Like one of those times is when you're trying to find your car when you come out of the grocery store. So like, I have no idea ever where I parked. So I'll go out of the Meijer door or the Walmart door or whatever it is, and I'll be like, okay, where's my car? Now it's good. I mean, I got that new car now, and Shannon's car too. They have those little things where you can press the button, and then it like chirps at you. And so like, the lights blink, and so I'm like, oh, where's my car? You hit it, and you go, oh, there it is. I can hear it over there. But with my truck, no go, man. I would just get that out there, and I have no idea where it is. You would think it's so big that you'd be able to see it over any other cars, but I don't see all that well either. And so sometimes I just wander around the parking lot like, where's my car? And eventually, thankfully, I'll find it. The other day I was like, I heard my phone go off, but I didn't know where my phone was. And so I just started to turn the living room over, like, where is my phone? And finally, AJ's like, it's right here, Dad. And he comes over and he hands it to me. And so I send a text message back to whoever texted me, and then I set it down again and then go about my business. Literally 30 seconds later, it goes off. And I'm like, where is my phone? And AJ's like, it's right here. He's like, didn't you just have this in your hand like 5 minutes ago, Dad? Why can't you keep track of anything? Well, because my brain just doesn't do that very well. It doesn't hold short-term information very well. And I think that we would all do well to learn that fact. Your brain was not intended to hold a bunch of information. Your brain was given to you to think about information. Have other things hold the information for you. So SDI had me do this training last fall, and it was called Getting Things Done. And so I was like right in the middle of like all sorts of work. I was having to work Saturdays. I was having to stay after during the day. The last thing I wanted to do was to take a whole day. This was an 8-hour webinar. Had to sit at my desk with my headphones on my head, listening to this guy drone on. And not only was he droning on, but then he would like randomly ask people questions. And so he'd be like, hey, Aaron, what do you think about? And so it's not like you could even space out or surf the internet or do whatever. You had to be listening to this guy for 8 hours. But out of 8 hours, I got one great thing from that seminar. And it was simply what I just told you. Don't trust your brain to remember things. Do other ways to make sure that you put things into your road to help you to remember. So he talked about inputs, like where are your inputs at? Where information comes to you. And so I began to think about it, and I got two places. One is my inbox on my desk with physical items in it, and I put stuff there that I need to do. Another one is my email inbox. Every morning I get to my desk, the first thing I do is check my email inbox. Those two things I look at every day. My calendar that's in my email, I look at it every day. And so what he said is, when you have an appointment or whatever, send yourself an email. Put it in that calendar so that you don't have to remember. You'll get to work on that day. You'll open it up and be like, oh yeah, I got an eye appointment at 1 o'clock. And so don't trust your brain to remember things. Put things into your road that you know that you're going to travel down in order to remember those things. Put it on a sticky note and put it in that inbox so that you realize, oh, I got to do that today. And don't take it out of the inbox until you're done with it. I've literally taken this philosophy to heart. Like a few times I've gone to work and forgot my laptop, and that's not good. You got to drive all the way back home and get your laptop. So I started just being like, I'll just lean it against the front door so that as I'm leaving, I could trip over it. And I'm like, oh, there's my computer. Okay, that didn't work because kids kept moving it around. And so I was like, I got to think of something different. So now on the night before work, I'll take it out and put it into my car so that I don't even have to remember it the next day. It's just already in the car, already ready to go. And these are just ways to kind of say your brain is not going to hold things. It's not going to remember things. So create spaces where those things will keep coming up again and again and again so that you don't forget them. And you might be like, Aaron, what in the world does this have to do with the parting of the Jordan River? Everything to do with the parting of the Jordan River. Because what does Joshua have them do? What does God have Joshua have them do? He has them get 12 stones out from the bottom of the Jordan River 12 stones that have been washed by the river, 12 stones that have been rounded down so that you can tell they're river stones. He says, I want you to bring them out. I want you to make a stack. I want you to make a circle. I want you to make a memorial so that every time that you look at that, every time that you see that, you will remember my faithfulness. You will remember that I keep my promises. You will remember that I do what I say that I will do. And not only will you remember, your kids will remember. Because your kids who are not even here at the parting of the Jordan River, 30, 40 years down the road, they're going to be like, hey, Dad, what's that pile of stones over there? Well, let me tell you what that pile of stones is. It's about the time that God miraculously brought us into the promised land. He parted the Jordan River, and we walked through it as if it was on dry ground. And God gave us the land that he promised to our forefather Abraham. Don't count on yourself to remember it. Don't count on yourself to recount it to the next generation. Build a memorial so that it's always in your face. So out in our lobby there, we actually have something similar to that, don't we? If you look at the wall there, there's 4 different pictures, and then there's a burnt cross right in the middle of it. What is that? You might stare at that and go, Aaron, why do you have a burnt cross on the wall? Or why is there a picture of a burning church building on your wall? That's kind of in bad taste. But this is what it is. Every once in a while I walk out of my office and it's right there in front of my face. And it forces me to stop and to remember that night. And I can remember it pretty vividly. I remember Jenny calling me up on the phone, and Jenny's like, hey, Pastor Aaron, the church is on fire. I'm like, what? The church is on fire? And so within 5 minutes, I'm here, Carol's here, a bunch of you are here, and we're all just staring at our church building literally burning to the ground. I remember the smell. I remember the firefighters coming out and saying, hey, what do you want us to save? And I remember I had a list of 3 or 4 things. I'm like, don't risk your life for anything. There's nothing, all the stuff is in there is just stuff. And I remember when the firefighter came over and said, hey, Aaron, do you just want us to push this building to the ground? I was like, what? That's a decision we have to make? Yeah, and he's like, yeah, can we just push it to the ground? Sure. And so I thought that night, I remember having a vivid thought, this is it. We can't come back from this. But a year later, we were standing in this very building, debt-free, because of generous people, community groups, businesses, churches. All of them came alongside of us and helped us to put a building back on this spot. And it was an amazing act of God. Okay, there was nothing about it that necessarily seemed miraculous, but it was the providence of God at work. And he got us to where we are today. So that's why we have that back there. Here we are 16 years later. There's not many days that I wake up in the morning and thinking about the church burning down at this point. I probably wouldn't think about it very much at all, except that I have a memorial out there. And so every time I come out of my office, I see it. New people sometimes will come into the building and they'll stare at that and go, what is this all about? And it gives me an opportunity to say, let me tell you what God did for us. Let me tell you about his faithfulness. Let me tell you how he fulfills his promises. Let me tell you how he's faithful to his people. And so it's a memorial, a way that we can look and we can remember about how God has worked in our lives in the past. And here's the interesting thing about memorials. Memorials are not just about the past, are they? Memorials are also to remind you that just like God was at work in your life then, God is still at work in your life today. Just like God was there when you came out of Egypt and I parted the Red Sea, God is there when he parted the Jordan River and you entered into the promised land. Just like God was there when he parted the river of the Jordan, he's with you in the land as you're trying to establish your faith in your community. And it's the same thing for us. Just like God was with us through Jesus and giving his life for us, he's still with you today. He's still walking your road through whatever difficulty you might face. And he's going to continue to do so into the future. So a memorial is not just about the past. It's about the present. And it's about what God wants to do in your life in the future as well. So here's the central truth. I didn't mean this to be a pun, but I guess it is. We need to burn God's victories into our memory so that we can always remember that he is with us. So we can always remember that he is with us. All right, so let's talk about this story here. So we left Joshua and the Israelites on the east side of the Jordan River last week, which is just north of the Dead Sea. Do I have a map here at all? Do you know? I may or may not. All right, this is the Jordan River. Do I have a map after this? Okay. So you can see that the people of Israel were over here on the east side of the Jordan River at a place called Abel Shittim, and that's where they had set up camp. And they've been here for a while, And they've used this as a kind of a base of operations to take over a lot of the land over here on the east side of the Jordan River. And we talked about how 2.5 tribes of Israel actually have settled over there. But part of the deal was that if they settled over there, they would still send some of their fighting soldiers to the west side of the Jordan River, or kind of the promised land proper, in order to help the other 9.5 tribes take over their allotment of land. And so we haven't yet kind of entered into the land of promise proper. That's not going to happen until we cross this very big natural barrier there called the Jordan River. And that's what we're going to talk about here today. Okay, go back to the picture before there. So this is what the Jordan River looks like at this particular point today. All right, and it's pretty daunting. If you think about, we only got one number here, and that number is the number 40,000. We're told that 40,000 troops from the 2.5 tribes that had already settled to the east of the river were going to head across. We don't have a number of exactly how many people actually were going to cross the river. But if there's 40,000 troops just from 2.5 tribes, think about how we have 9.5 tribes where it's everybody, women, children, the elderly, normal people. I mean, just everybody is going to be crossing the Jordan River. So estimates are around 900,000 to 1.1 million Israelites about at this point that were going to cross this Jordan River. So just think about how daunting that would be. Now, this doesn't look all that bad. And the reason why is because even at its flood stage, the Jordan River today is not much to look at. And the reason why is because of modern day irrigation. You know, we divert a lot of the water out of the Jordan River for farming. And so back in the ancient world, they didn't really do that. And so it was a lot bigger river then than it used to be, than it is today. Back then at flood stage, the Jordan River at this point, just north of the Dead Sea, it could be, a mile wide and it could be up to 150 feet deep. So try to get 1 million people, including, children, babies, old people, try to get them across that river. Cattle, stuff. I mean, it'd be an almost impossible task. You couldn't do it, right? There's no way you could do that unless God does a miracle. And what's interesting to me is that God doesn't just lay it all out. God just doesn't say to the people, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to part the Jordan River, and you're going to walk through as if it's on dry ground. Instead, he just says, I want you to step foot into the Jordan River and let me take care of the rest. I mean, that had to be absolutely terrifying. So this is what happens. Joshua gathers together the priests, and he says, okay, I want you to get the Ark of the Covenant, and then I want you to go down into the water there, and I want you to step foot into the water, and then we'll see what happens. He doesn't really give them an explanation. Oh, yeah, God's going to pile up the water. Don't worry about it. Just go stand down in the riverbed. I mean, if I was a priest, I'd be looking like, what? Explain again? What did you say? Did you say you wanted me to go down and step into the Jordan River with this box? Yes, do that. I mean, that would be absolutely terrifying. All right, so what is this box, this Ark of the Covenant? And that's literally what it is. I mean, if you've ever seen Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, it's actually a pretty good rendering of the Ark of the Covenant. It's a literal piece of furniture that the Israelites built back when they were given the law. They carried it with them through 40 years of wilderness wanderings. So every time that they would set up camp, they would build a tent called the tabernacle. And as part of the tabernacle would be a place called the holy place. And there they would put the Ark of the Covenant in there. And it was meant to symbolize the very presence of God. They kept it behind very thick curtains. And the priests would go in there and they would offer their special sacrifices. And so it was ornate. It was made of special wood. It was inlaid with gold. Inside of the ark were a couple of very important items. One of them was the literal 10 commandments that God had written on and given to Moses. Another thing was Aaron's rod. If you remember that story, that it actually budded and had flowers coming out of it. That was in the Ark of the Covenant. And it was meant to look like a throne. Because if you see pictures of God in the Old Testament, Isaiah, Ezekiel, or the picture of God that we get in the book of Revelation as well, you see that he's carried by angels called cherubim or seraphim. And the Ark of the Covenant had 2 cherubim, and they're reaching out, and their wings are touching, and this was said to be the seat of God, the mercy seat, where God dwells. And so the Ark of the Covenant was a symbol of the presence of God, that God is with his people. And so it's fitting, that God says to Joshua, have the priests take the ark and take it down into the water first, so that people know that it is me that's parting the Jordan River, that it's me doing this miracle, that it's me paving the way for them to enter into the land of promise and to take it just like I told them that they would. And so the Ark of the Covenant becomes a symbol of God's presence with his people, that God is doing exactly what he said that he was going to do. So God did not like two things when it came to the Ark of the Covenant. One, he did not like people treating it like a common box. Okay, it was not a common box. It was a symbol of the presence of God. And so we have that one story, if you remember, that they're carrying the ark and they're carrying it on poles because God had said, do not touch it. It is not a common box. You don't touch it. Well, some mules kind of got jostled a little bit and the ark begins to tip. And so there's a guy by the name of Uzziah who reaches out his hand to kind of steady the ark. Well, he ends up losing his life. Why? What did he do so wrong? All he was trying to do was steady the Ark of the Covenant. Because God does not need Uzziah to take care of him. That's the point. God told him not to touch it. It is not a common box. It's a supernatural box. And God doesn't need human beings to look after it. God can look after himself. The second thing God does not like when it comes to the Ark of the Covenant is he doesn't like people treating it like a magical talisman, as if it's some sort of good luck charm. So at one point, the Israelites start to believe that as long as we have the box, the magic box, and we take it into battle with us, we will win. And so they took it into battle with the Philistines, and God kind of understands that that's how they're looking at the box at this point, and he says, fine, I'm just going to have you lose. And so they lose the battle big time, and the Philistines actually capture the Ark of the Covenant, and they take it back to their land and into their temple of their God. So think about what a moral victory this would have been for the Philistines. We got their box that's a symbol of their God. How much more powerful are we than they? How much more powerful are our gods than their God is? Okay, so what happened when they had the Ark of the Covenant under their control? Well, not good things. First of all, they all started getting tumors. Second of all, there was a plague of rats. And third of all, the statue of their god Dagon just one day toppled down of its own accord and fell prostrate right before the Ark of the Covenant. And it was at that point that the Philistines said, we do not want this box anymore. And so they put it onto some mules, and they just kind of had them go off into Israelite territory. You take it back. We're fine. We don't want it anymore. And so this was supposed to be the symbol of God's presence. It wasn't some sort of magical token. It wasn't some sort of common box. This was God, his symbol of his presence with his people, and that he keeps his promises. So Joshua's like, all right, priests, take the ark, go down into the river. And so as soon as the first priest dips his toe in the water, whoosh, the water starts to pile up. And you can kind of see a little evidence of this. Archaeologists think that they can see evidence of this about 20 miles up from this point, where the water seems to have piled up on top of itself. Until all of the Israelites, almost 1 million of them, went through as if on dry ground. What does this remind you of? It reminds you of the parting of the Red Sea. Intentionally. They're like bookends. Just like God miraculously brought you out of slavery in Egypt, God is going to also miraculously bring you into the land of promise. God is involved every step of the way. You can trust him. Just like he was involved with your forefathers, he's involved in your life today. And then what happens? After everybody gets through, Joshua tells 12 people, one from each of the 12 tribes, to get a stone. And the stones that we're talking about here, are probably not like little tiny rocks. These were shoulder stones, stones that they had to lift up and carry, heavy stones, stones that had been worn down by the river. And you could tell, right? You could tell the stone that's been at the bottom of a river versus a stone that's just kind of sitting out on the bank. And God wanted there to be 12 river stones taken out and stacked up so that everybody knew that God was the one who did a miracle there that day. And just like God parted the Red Sea, God also parted the Jordan because he was with the people on the mission that he had sent them on. So the first scene is the parting of the Jordan River and the people crossing. And the second scene here has to do with these stones of remembrance. These 12 stones that we don't know exactly what they did with them. We don't know if they stacked them into a 12-stone high stack or whether they created a circle out of them. We don't know exactly what this looked like, but we do know that it endured. Whoever wrote the book of Joshua down, maybe 30, 40 years later, He says, you can go to Gilgal today. You can see it with your own eyes. The memorial is still there. Those river stones are still there, and you can see how God helped his people and how God moved us along and how he was there for us when we needed him the most. And so Joshua says, create a memorial about how God miraculously parted the Jordan River. Just like he did with our forefathers in Egypt, he is doing the same thing for us now. And again, it wasn't just for the people to sit there and look at it and remember, the ones that were actually there, but it was also for future generations. So that, the kid kind of tugs on mom's sleeve and says, hey, what's that? Well, let me tell you what God has done. So it's for the future generations also to be able to realize the work of God in their life. All right, so the Israelites were on the east side of the Jordan River in Abel Shittim, and now they've moved across the Jordan River as if on dry ground, and now they're going to set up shop at a place called Gilgal. And that's going to kind of be their base of operations here for a little bit longer. But before they move on and before they really begin the mission that God has given to them, God wanted them to take a moment to create a memorial so they could remember the miraculous things that God has done for them. And that can be the fortitude and the courage that they need in the future to understand that just like God was with us at the Jordan, God's going to be with us at Jericho. And just like God was with us at Jericho, he's going to be with us as we continue to follow his mission. God is there for us. He's faithful to his promises. All right, so what can we learn from this story? What can we learn from this story? Well, three things. The first thing is that we should find ways to highlight or to remember God's victory in our lives. We should find ways to remember God's past victories in our life. And we see this all throughout Scripture. Let's go all the way back to Genesis 1. Did God give a sign to us in Genesis 1? Yeah, the Sabbath. He worked 6 days. On the seventh day, he rested. And then he instituted the Sabbath day that every 7 days that you should take a break, that you should rest from your work, and you should remember that God did the same. You go on to Genesis chapter 9, and we see something called the rainbow. And why did God show Noah and his family the rainbow? It was a sign that he would never flood the earth again like he just did. And we could go on and on. There are all sorts of signs. The festivals themselves that God built into the law, the festival of unleavened bread, the festival of tents, the Passover festival. These were all built into their calendars as kind of just putting something down to say, hey, this is going to cause you to remember this past event. Probably the one that we're most familiar with is the Passover. What's that meant to symbolize? What's that meant to point back to? It's meant to point back to the 10 plagues in Egypt and how the people of Israel were led out miraculously from the suffering underneath the hand of Pharaoh. How they put the blood of the lamb on the doorposts of their home and the angel of death passed over their house. Okay, it was just, put this into your calendar every year. So every year you're forced to remember what God has done for you and the great things that he brought to you. Here we have the stones of remembrance. Stack of stones, that's all it is. But it's meant to authenticate exactly what happened, to remind the people of the land that God had given to them by his miraculous power, and that he was going to continue to be with them and to care for them and to lead them and to protect them into the future. This is a new generation. They weren't the generation that saw the parting of the Red Sea. Really, we're told there's only 2 people alive that still remember the parting of the Red Sea. That would be Caleb and Joshua. They were allowed to remain alive because of their faith when they were sent on that spy mission. But as for everybody else, we're in a completely new generation. Maybe they don't even remember the parting of the Red Sea. Maybe sometimes they scratch their head and they think, did that really happen? And so what God is saying is, just like I was with your parents' generation, I am with you. I'm going to do exactly what I said I was going to do. I'm going to fulfill the promises that I made to Abraham. You just wait and see. And so these 2 events become so interconnected that often in Scripture, they're talked about as if they're the same event. This comes from Psalm 114. When Israel came out of Egypt, when the house of Jacob came out from a foreign people, the sea looked and fled. What sea? The Red Sea. And the Jordan looked and turned back. Why was it, O sea, that you fled? Why was it, O Jordan, that you turned back? Tremble, O earth, at the presence of the Lord and at the presence of the God of Jacob. So just looking in retrospect, you got somebody few hundred years later that sees it as the same event. God miraculously brought people out of Egypt, and God miraculously brought those same people back into the land that he had promised to them. It was all part of God's plan all along. And we can do the same thing. We see like events that span centuries, and we can see the hand of God and how he was preparing everything for Jesus to come. And we can look today and we can see how God is preparing for Jesus to return. Just like God was faithful in the past, he is there for us in the present, and he will be with us in the future. We just need to remember, find ways, put things into our road that cause us to remember the wonderful work of God. There's a guy by the name of Safed, and his story was told by an author named William Barton. The story goes like this. He was traveling on a train one day across the country, and they were at some random place in Kansas, and the train stopped for lunch. So everybody kind of poured off the train and were able to go to the restaurant of their choice. And so this guy, Safed, he just was walking to the restaurant, and on his way there was a little tiny park, and he noticed that there was this big plaque. And so he's like, oh, I wonder what that plaque says. And so he walks over to the plaque, and on it is a picture of this. It's a Lincoln pin drawhead. So it used to be that when you wanted to couple two train cars together, you would do it with a pin. Very similar to how you might put a trailer in today. You put pin down and so that the two things don't fall apart from each other. But, you're doing this all day, every day. This can be very dangerous. In fact, lots of people got their hands crushed. Some people even lost their lives because this was such a dangerous job. Until somebody came along and invented something called the safety coupler. And that's probably what you're familiar with now, where the train car just backs into the one right behind it, and they just automatically kind of link together. A human being does not have to be involved in there at all, doesn't have to get their hands in there at all. And so on this little plaque was just a picture of the old Lincoln pin drawhead, and then beneath it were just 3 words, lest we forget. So it was a train yard. And the whole idea was for people to remember, hey, there are a lot of people, some lost their lives, some people had their hands crushed, but now we don't have to worry about that because of this great new invention. So let's always be grateful for this brand new invention. And so the guy thought this was a pretty cool memorial, pretty cool reminder. And so he went into the Taco Bell or whatever the fast food restaurant was nearby and started talking to the cashier about it. Like, hey, right there next door in that park, there's that plaque, for the safety coupler. That's a pretty cool little plaque. It's a good way to remember, what this invention has done and how it's changed our lives. And he's like, what's out there again? I don't remember ever seeing anything in that park. So, A, we should create things that cause us to remember. B, we should make sure that they're intentionally in our road so that we do remember. Okay, otherwise, we are going to forget. We need to remember the great things that God has done. So what do we have? We are not a kind of church that necessarily has a lot of paintings or drawings or icons or memorials like some churches may have. What do we have? What do you see behind me? Okay, there's a screen. What's behind the screen? A cross. What's out in front of our building? What's that big white thing out in front of our building? We have a huge cross. We got a cross out there in our foyer. Why? What's the point? To remember. That's the point. To remember what Jesus has done. To remember that he gave himself for us on the cross. That he provided salvation for us so that we could be welcomed into God's eternal kingdom. So the Israelites were saved from slavery and welcomed into the land of promise, and that was worth memorializing. How much more? The sacrifice of Christ. Through the sacrifice of Christ, all of us can be made right with God. That is something that we must remember. Never take for granted. Never forget that it's there, but allow us to point to that reality over and over and over again of what Jesus has done. And to pass it on to the next generation. So the next generation comes and says, hey, what do we got 2 pieces of wood up there for? What's that for? Let me tell you the story of Jesus. Let me tell you what he's done for you and for me. So I have a question. Do you have any memorial stones in your life? Do you have anything that you intentionally put in your road to cause you to remember? And maybe not necessarily something that God has done, but to remember anything. Maybe you have something sitting out in your garden. Maybe you have pictures that you put on your wall, maybe pictures of your wedding day, or maybe pictures of when your kids were babies. And every time you look at them, you remember exactly what that time in life was about, exactly why that time was significant. So there are two things to commemorate here when we're talking about the work of God. And we've kind of been hitting on both of them a little bit. One of them is a miracle, and one of them is the providence of God. And we tend to kind of divide these up in hard and fast categories. So let's say somebody that you love is sick, okay, and near death. And then for some reason, out of nowhere, they get better. And everybody's sitting there saying there's no physical reason why this person should have got better. We would call that a miracle, right? What about somebody else? Maybe they have the same disease, and they go to a doctor. And that doctor prescribes medication or treatments, and those treatments eradicate the cancer or whatever might be wrong with that person and help them to get better. Okay, we might not look at that and say it's a miracle per se, but it is still the providence of God. And so we might kind of divide those two things up pretty firmly in our head. Well, one we can't explain, the other one we can. But in reality, God is working in both. God is the author of both. And so we're not just commemorating the piling up of the Jordan River. We're commemorating the things that God has done that may seem ordinary, that may seem everyday, but God is still at work. I mean, we could look back at the building of this church. Yeah, we got some strange gifts. We got a bunch of money from the Lilly Foundation. How'd that happen? We got some money from other churches. But you could look back at it and say, that's just people being generous. It's just everyday natural means. There was nothing miraculous about it. I mean, money just didn't show up on our doorstep, But God was still at work. He was at work through providence. And so we need to remember providence just as much as we remember a miracle. And that can cause us to remember how God has made a significant impact in our life. There's a well-known hymn. We're going to sing it here in a second. Come thou fount of every blessing. Come thou fount of every blessing. And I think, if I remember right, I looked this up like 2 or 3 years ago. I looked at our come thou fount of every blessing. And I think we removed the word from there. We change it or translate it. Well, we'll see here in a second when we sing it. But in the original, there's a word called Ebenezer. Okay, like Ebenezer Scrooge. Okay, and here I raise my Ebenezer. What in the world is an Ebenezer? Well, it comes from two Hebrew words, actually. It's a compound word. Eben, which means stone, and Netzer, which means remember. I remember. Stones of remembrance. So here I lift my Ebenezer. And it comes exactly from this passage we're studying here today. We have this monument. We have these stones that are stacked up that are causing us to remember God's work in the life of the Israelites, that he parted the Jordan River. But it's not the only Ebenezer that there needs to be. You and I can have stones of remembrance. You and I can have memorials that we put in our way. You and I can have traditions that we make sure that we celebrate every year to remember the things that God has done for us. So literally, here I am talking for 40 minutes. I could sum up everything I say today just in 2 lines from this hymn. Listen to what they say. Come thou fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy grace. Streams of mercy never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise. That's the part of the hymn that you're familiar with and you probably know by heart. Here's the part of the hymn I'm talking about. Here I raise my Ebenezer. Here by thy great help I've come, and I hope by thy good pleasure safely to arrive at home. All right, let's unpack that, because we got a past, present, and future part of this hymn, right? What's the past part? Here I raise my Ebenezer, my stones of remembrance, so that I can remember that I've gotten here by your help. That's the first thought, right? So it's about the past. I have this thing that's causing me to remember what you have done for me in the past. Then look at the second part. And I hope that by thy good pleasure safely to arrive at home. So I've gotten here because of your faithfulness in the past. I understand that you are faithful now and that you're going to help me get to where I'm supposed to go, which is home with you in your perfect kingdom of righteousness, justice, and peace. There is so much great theology in these 2 lines. I'm going to remember what you did in the past, and that's going to help me to have strength that you're still at work in my life today. And I know that because of your faithfulness and that you stick to your promises, that you're going to get me exactly where you said you were going to get me in the end, that I'm going to be at home with you. And that's exactly what this memorial was supposed to do for the Israelites. Remind them of God's work for them in the past. Remind them that God is still involved in their mission in the present, and know that God is going to get them exactly where they need to be in the future. So that's the first thing I think we need to learn, is we need to find ways to highlight God's victory in our life And then we need to allow those things to remind us and those around us of God's love and God's power. God's miracles for us, God's providence in our lives, God's provision for us, God's care for us. I want to talk for a second about the Taj Mahal. Okay, you probably all heard about the Taj Mahal. Maybe some of you have even been there to visit. But construction on the Taj Mahal began in the year 1629. There was an Indian ruler, and his name was Jahan. And he had a favorite wife. I mean, he had a lot of wives, but one of the wives was his favorite, and she died. And he wanted to create the biggest memorial that he could possibly create so that everybody would always remember her. So literally, it started with them putting her into a casket, a box. And then they built the Taj Mahal around her. And the construction on this marvelous building, which still stands today and people go to visit, it took a lot of years and a lot of time and a lot of thought. And about 3 years after they began construction, Jahan was just wandering through the inside of it, and he came across this box that he did not know what it was. He actually stubbed his toe on it, and he got extremely angry. And he said, "Who put this box in here? I want it gone, and I want it gone today." And so, the workers did just that. They took the box out and they threw it away. It wasn't but 2 months later that he began to think about, hey, where's my wife's casket? He had it thrown away. The entire reason that the building was built was to be a memorial for her, but he had begun to think of it as a feat of architectural beauty, and he'd forgotten about its true mission and true point. So, we can create a memorial, but if we don't remember what the memorial is for, then what good is it? People do that all the time. They'll plant a tree, and the tree is supposed to symbolize somebody or something, and then it doesn't take but 10, 15 years before it's just a tree, and nobody remembers exactly what it was there for. So if we're going to create these stones of remembrance, then we need to remember what the stones of remembrance are for and what they're meant to remind us of. So do we do anything like this? Well, isn't that what communion is? Isn't that why we celebrate communion? Is to celebrate the sacrifice of Christ. It's something that we bake into our calendar, that we do, every quarter, so that we remember that Jesus' body was broken for us and that his blood was spilled for us. You go to some churches, and some churches celebrate communion every Sunday. It's just kind of part of the service. When the sermon is over or the service is over, you filter to the front, and the priest or pastor, whoever, gives you a little piece of bread, and they give you some juice to drink or wine to drink, and then you go on your merry way. And I've often had people say, Aaron, why don't we do communion every Sunday? And the reason why is this very reason here. I don't want it ever to be just something that we do. I want it to be something that causes us to remember what Christ has done. I'm not saying you can't remember what Christ has done if you do it every week. But to me, personally, if I do something every week, it just becomes part of the routine, and it loses its meaning. And every time we celebrate communion, I want us to remember how Jesus' body was broken for us, that he bled for us, that he took the wrath of God and our sins on his shoulders and paid the price for us so that we could have eternal life with him. I don't ever want us to lose sight of that great fact. And so that's why we have communion. We bake it into our calendar so that we have to be forced to stop and say, hey, remember what God has done for you. Give thanks to God for what he has done for you. And understand that he's not just done it for you in the past. God is still at work in your life today, and God will take you home in the future. We just need to understand his faithfulness and that he is a great promise keeper. So we want to put memorials in our road so that we remember the things that God has done for us in the past, whether by a miracle or by providence. And the last thing is also to understand that that teaches us that God is still there for us today. He's there for us in the past, but God does not change. It's not like he was with us 15 years ago, but now he's not. God is still at work in our hearts and lives as we speak. And these things can help us to remember that. When Jada was a baby, sorry, Jada, I'm going to tell a story. When Jada was a baby, we were at a swimming pool. I think it might have been in New York. We were like at a campground or something, and there was this swimming pool there. And she had never been in a swimming pool before in her life. She's like maybe one, maybe not even quite one yet. And so I was like, well, I'll just try to get her used to the water. So I, grabbed her and held her, and I just kind of walked into the shallow end of the pool, and then slowly, started to get a little deeper and a little deeper, get her little toes wet, get her legs wet. And, I got all the way out to like it's 4 or 5 feet deep, and she's fine. She's happy. She's loving the water. And so I'm in there for about 5 or 6 minutes, and then I slowly walk back out. And then somebody else, I can't remember who it was, but somebody else grabbed her, and they're like, oh, I'm going to take her down into the water too. So they started to take her down into the water, and then Jada just started screaming like bloody murder, like she was being killed or something. And the person, I can't remember who it was, that put her in the water was like, okay, I'm out, and like brought her back up. And so I began to think, well, she must not like the water anymore. But I was like, I'll try it one more time. And so I grabbed her, and I took her back down into the water, and we went out into the deep end, and she was fine. And began to think about that. Why the difference? Why was she fine when I was holding her? She was not fine when somebody else was holding her. And because she knew me, and she trusted me, because I was her dad. I was the one that was with her all the time. Being with me helped the fear to melt away. Being with me helped to give her confidence and peace, even in an uncertain present and in the face of an uncertain future. So I've tried to say this a few times by now, but stones of remembrance are not just about the past. I mean, that would be silly. They're also to show us that just like God was with us back then, his presence was with us back then, his presence is still with us today. So you're going to face difficulty. You're going to get sick. People you love are going to get sick. You're going to have chronic pain. You're going to have relationship issues. There are things at work that won't go well. You're going to face tough times. And it's tempting in times like that to say, well, I remember when God was with me 5 years ago, but it doesn't seem like he is with me anymore. And that's just not true. God is with you just as much today. His presence is involved in your life just as much today as it was then. Now, it might take you 3 or 4 years to look back on today and see, oh yeah, God was working and God was doing things. But we need to trust that he is. And when we look at it in the rearview mirror, we'll see that he was. And so the fact that God has worked in our past should inform us and give us peace that God's presence is with us today and will continue to be with us into the future. Just like God was with the Israelites at the Red Sea, he was with them at the Jordan. And just like he was with them at the Jordan, he was with them at Jericho. And just like he was with them at Jericho when the walls came tumbling down, he was with them the rest of the mission as well. And it's the same thing. Just like God was with us through Jesus, he's still with us today and will be with us in the future. One of the names that Jesus goes by in the Bible is Emmanuel. That's what Emmanuel means, is God with us. Kind of like the Ark of the Covenant was a symbol of the presence of God. Jesus was literally the presence of God among his people. But here's where it gets even stranger. Jesus says to his disciples in the upper room right before he ascends into heaven, right before the last week of his life, and he says, I got to go. And it's a good thing that I'm going, because when I go, then I'm going to be able to send the Spirit of God to you, and he is going to be with you always. And what that tells me is that having the Spirit of God in our hearts as a constant presence is better than having the person of Jesus stand right beside us. It's a pretty strange thought. But Jesus says, if I don't go, then I can't send the Comforter to you. I can't send the Advocate to you to be with you forever. And so I'm going to go so that he can come. And so the Spirit of God is the presence in our lives today. Some of Jesus' last words right before he ascended up into heaven was, behold, I am with you always, even to the very end of the age. That's the very last sentence in the book of Matthew. God is with you. I don't know what difficulty you're facing today, but allow God's presence into your life. Remember past situations, things that are already in the rearview mirror that you can look at and say, yeah, God clearly was at work there. God did a miracle, or God was involved in providence in my life then. And let that encourage you that God is still at work in your life today. That whatever's going on now isn't a completed story. One day you'll be able to look back on it and say, yeah, that's how God was working. Maybe I didn't know it at the time, I didn't realize it at the time, but God was at work. And he's going to continue to be at work until we end up home with him forever. Let's pray. Dear Lord, again, as we think about the parting of the Jordan River, this miracle that you performed, and how you wanted the Israelites to remember that it happened, and you wanted it to inform their life. Lord, we too can look back at your work in our life. We can look back at what you did for us on the cross. We can look back at the sacrifice that you made on our behalf. And Lord, help us to remember that that great act of love didn't just stop there, that you still love us today, that you are still involved in our lives today, and that you have a grand plan for us in the future. We pray that in your wonderful name. Amen.